Marcus Rivera had seen plenty of strange things during his 12 years as a Marine, but nothing had prepared him for the night the sky caught fire. He stood on the balcony of his Denver apartment, beer growing warm in his hand, watching streaks of brilliant green and gold tear across the darkness like celestial claws ripping through black fabric. The news had called it a meteor shower, an astronomical event that occurred every 70 years, something beautiful and harmless to observe. They were wrong on at least one count. Marcus felt it in his bones, that old instinct that had kept him alive in Kandahar and Fallujah, the sixth sense that whispered when something was desperately, fundamentally wrong. The meteors weren't falling randomly, they were falling in patterns, concentrated clusters hitting major cities across the globe, and the news anchors' voices had shifted from excitement to barely concealed panic in the last 20 minutes. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from old military buddies, all saying the same thing. Get ready, get armed, get out. Then the screaming started. Not from his television, but from the street below, raw and primal and spreading like wildfire through the apartment complex. Marcus moved inside, his training taking over as he locked the balcony door and moved toward his bedroom closet where he kept his Glock and the tactical bag he'd promised himself he'd never need again. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the building into darkness broken only by emergency lights in the hallway and the eerie green glow still pulsing from the sky. Someone pounded on his door, frantic and desperate, and he recognized his neighbor Katie Sullivan's voice calling his name. He grabbed the gun, checked the clip, and looked through the peephole to see Katie, still in her nursing scrubs, her face streaked with blood that he hoped wasn't hers. He opened the door and pulled her inside quickly, scanning the hallway before slamming it shut and engaging every lock. "They're eating people, Marcus," she gasped, trembling against his kitchen counter. "In the emergency room, the meteor victims we brought in, they died and then they just got back up and started attacking everyone. I saw Dr. Mitchell get his throat torn out by a woman who'd been dead for 10 minutes. Marcus wanted to tell her she was in shock, that she'd misunderstood what she'd seen, but more screams echoed through the building, closer now, and something heavy slammed against a door several floors below. His military mind shifted into survival mode, running through scenarios and probabilities, discarding impossible explanations because the impossible was clearly happening. He moved to his window and looked down at the parking lot where fires burned and scattered vehicles and people ran in all directions while other people, or things that used to be people, chased them with jerking, unnatural movements. Then he saw something that made his blood freeze. Lights in the sky but not meteors this time. These lights moved with purpose, hovering and darting, metallic shapes that reflected the flames below in ways that no aircraft he'd ever seen could manage. 3 more survivors found their way to his door over the next hour. Dylan Cooper, a 17-year-old kid from upstairs who had his laptop bag and enough computer equipment to hack the Pentagon. Dr. Amanda Foster, an older woman who'd been Katie's colleague and had somehow fought her way out of the same hospital. And Robert Hayes, a retired cop from down the hall who carried a shotgun and enough ammunition to start a small war. They barricaded Marcus's door with furniture and tried to make sense of the senseless. Dylan managed to get his laptop running on battery power and connected to scattered internet signals, showing them news feeds from around the world, the same chaos, the same attacks, the same impossible corpses rising and hunting the living, and in every major city, those strange lights hovering and watching like predatory gods observing an experiment. "This isn't just a zombie outbreak," Dylan said, his young face illuminated by the screen's glow. "Something came down with those meteors, something that's been watching us ever since, and I don't think they're here to help." Marcus looked at his small group of survivors, then back out at the burning city and the lights dancing in the darkness above it, and realized that humanity's fight for survival had just become infinitely more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The first light of dawn brought no comfort, only clarity to the nightmare that had consumed Denver overnight. Marcus led his group down the apartment building's stairwell. Stepping over bodies he tried not to look at too closely, listening for the telltale shuffling and moaning that signaled the infected. Robert Hayes moved behind him with the shotgun raised, while Katie and Amanda stayed in the middle, helping Dylan carry his equipment. The teenager had insisted his technology might be their only advantage, and Marcus had learned long ago not to dismiss any potential weapon. They made it to the parking garage where Marcus's old pickup truck sat untouched, and for a moment he thought their luck might hold. Then the shrieking started, echoing off concrete walls as a dozen infected came charging from the shadows with that horrible jerking speed that shouldn't be possible for corpses. Robert fired twice, dropping 2 of them, but the sound brought more, and Marcus knew they'd be overwhelmed in seconds. He gunned the engine and screamed for everyone to get in, not waiting for doors to close before he slammed the accelerator and crashed through the garage barrier into the blood-red morning light. They drove through streets that looked like war zones, past overturned emergency vehicles and buildings still burning from the night's chaos, seeing scattered groups of survivors and even larger groups of the infected hunting them. But it was what Dylan spotted through the truck's rear window that changed everything. One of the alien craft, hovering low over downtown, had extended some kind of mechanical appendage that was literally scooping up the infected and pulling them into the ship's belly like a farmer harvesting crops. "They're collecting them," Dylan said, his voice cracking with fear and excitement. "The aliens aren't running from the zombies, they're gathering them up like specimens." Amanda leaned forward from the back seat, her medical mind already working the problem. "If they're harvesting the infected, they must have some use for them, which means they either created the virus or they're studying it, and neither option is good for us." Marcus changed course, heading away from downtown toward the outskirts where he knew an old National Guard depot sat mostly abandoned. They needed shelter, supplies, and time to think, and driving aimlessly would only get them killed when the gas ran out. The depot's gates had been breached, but not by zombies. The metal was peeled back in ways that suggested immense force supplied from above, and scorch marks blackened the guard towers in patterns that Marcus recognized as energy weapon signatures, though he'd never seen them outside of science fiction movies. They found the main bunker's heavy doors still intact, and Robert used his old police override codes on the electronic lock, somehow still functional on backup power. Inside, they discovered a scene that made Katie gasp and turn away. Military personnel lay dead at their stations, but not from zombie attacks. Their bodies showed signs of surgical precision, organs removed with clinical efficiency, and strange metallic devices attached to their skulls like obscene crowns. Dylan set up his laptop on a desk someone would never return to and started hacking into the depot's computer systems while the others searched for supplies and weapons. What he found in the classified files made him call everyone over with urgent desperation in his voice. The documents dated back 3 months, communications between the Pentagon and a Black Ops division called Project Nightfall. They'd been tracking unusual signals from deep space, signals that weren't random but clearly mathematical, clearly intelligent, clearly getting closer. 2 weeks before the meteor shower, contact had been established, and the aliens had made an offer. They would share technology, cure diseases, advance human civilization by centuries, but they needed something in return. They needed to conduct experiments, to test a biological agent they developed on Earth's population, to see how humans would respond to an extinction-level threat. The files ended abruptly on the day of the meteor shower with a final message. They lied. The test has begun. God help us all. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold fury that had sustained him through the worst firefights of his career. Humanity hadn't just been attacked. They'd been betrayed, sold out by their own leaders who'd been naive enough to trust something from the stars. The aliens hadn't come to invade Earth. They'd come to run an experiment, and the zombie outbreak was their laboratory, with every man, woman, and child on the planet serving as unwilling test subjects. "We need to find other survivors," Marcus said, his voice hard as steel. "We need to organize to fight back against both the infected and whatever's controlling them from those ships. We need to show these things that humanity doesn't go quietly into the dark." Outside, another alien craft drifted past, its hull reflecting the morning sun like a mechanical vulture circling a dying world, and Marcus Rivera made a promise to himself that before this was over, he'd find a way to make them bleed. The depot became their home for 3 days, 3 days of watching the alien ships move across the sky with increasing purpose and coordination that sent chills down Marcus's spine. But it was on the 4th morning when Dylan picked up radio chatter that changed everything. A military frequency broadcasting from the old Fort Carson installation 40 miles south, and a woman's voice calling herself Colonel Patricia Monroe requesting any surviving military personnel to rendezvous for coordinated resistance. Marcus knew it could be a trap, but staying isolated would only get them killed eventually, so they loaded the truck with weapons from the depot's armory and headed south through back roads that the infected hadn't completely overrun. What they witnessed along the way shattered any remaining hope that this was simply a zombie outbreak spinning out of control. They watched from a highway overpass as 3 alien craft herded a massive group of infected through the streets below like shepherds directing livestock, using pulses of blue light that seemed to agitate and guide the creatures toward specific destinations. The infected responded to the alien technology, moving in formation, stopping and starting on command, transformed from mindless predators into a grotesque army under extraterrestrial control. "They're not just studying them anymore," Robert said, his knuckles white on the shotgun. "They're weaponizing them, turning them into soldiers." Amanda's face had gone pale as she watched the horrible parade below. "If they can control the infected, they can direct them against any surviving human strongholds, use them to wipe us out without risking their own forces. We're not just fighting zombies or aliens anymore, we're fighting both at once." They reached Fort Carson by noon, and Marcus felt a surge of hope at seeing the fortified perimeter, armed guards, and at least 200 survivors moving with purpose behind concrete barriers and razor wire. Colonel Patricia Monroe met them at the gate, a steel-haired woman in her 50s whose eyes held the kind of hardness that came from making impossible decisions and living with the consequences. She welcomed them into the compound and gave them the grim situation report during a briefing that included her top people: Major Vincent Cole, her second-in-command, Lieutenant Jessica Parks, who handled reconnaissance, and Sergeant Thomas Wade, in charge of training civilian survivors to fight. Patricia explained that they'd been observing the aliens' activities and had come to a terrifying conclusion. The extraterrestrials were conducting some kind of elimination process, pitting humans against the infected in scenarios that seemed designed to test intelligence, adaptability, cooperation, and survival instincts. Small survivor groups that showed promise were often left alone temporarily, while larger, more chaotic groups were systematically destroyed by directed zombie hordes. "They're judging us," Patricia said, her voice cutting through the briefed room like a blade. "Every action we take, every decision we make, they're watching and evaluating like we're contestants in some cosmic game show where the losers don't just go home, they go extinct." Dylan had integrated his laptop into the fort's computer systems and pulled up footage from security cameras across the region, showing the same pattern repeated endlessly. Aliens observing, humans struggling to survive, the infected serving as the instrument of natural selection. The evidence was undeniable and horrifying in its implications. The next day, Marcus volunteered for a rescue mission when scouts reported survivors trapped in a collapsed shopping mall 15 miles east. He took Robert and Jessica Parks with him, along with 4 soldiers Patricia could spare, and they found the mall surrounded by infected that were clearly being held in position by an alien craft hovering overhead. It was a test, Marcus realized. The aliens wanted to see if the fort's people would risk themselves for strangers, wanted to measure human compassion against human survival instinct. They fought their way in through a service entrance, losing 1 soldier to a pack of infected that moved with unnatural coordination, and found 12 survivors barricaded in a sporting goods store, including a 9-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez who clutched a baseball bat like a lifeline and had eyes far too old for her young face. Her parents hadn't made it, but she'd survived 3 days alone before the others found her, and something in her fierce determination reminded Marcus why he was fighting. The escape was a running battle through corridors filled with the infected, with the alien ship adjusting its position to observe from different angles, clearly recording everything. Marcus carried Emma on his back while Robert and Jessica provided covering fire, and they made it back to the trucks with 11 survivors and 3 soldiers, a cost Patricia would consider acceptable even though Marcus hated the mathematics of it. That night, as Emma slept in the fort's makeshift orphanage with 24 other children who'd lost everything, Dylan cracked deeper into the alien communications network and translated a message that confirmed their worst fears. Testing phase 67% complete. Preliminary data suggests indigenous species lacks sufficient adaptive capacity. Recommend termination and planetary reset for alternative specimen introduction. Earth wasn't just a testing ground, it was an audition and humanity was failing. Dylan's translation of the alien message spread through Fort Carson like wildfire, igniting both terror and rage in equal measure. Marcus watched as Patricia Monroe made the decision that would define humanity's response. She ordered Dylan to broadcast everything they'd learned on every frequency possible, military and civilian, AM and FM, shortwave and digital, sending the truth screaming across the airwaves to every survivor who could still receive it. The aliens weren't invaders in the traditional sense. They were exterminators who decided humanity was a failed experiment, and the zombie virus was just the first phase of clearing Earth for whatever species they deemed more worthy. Within 24 hours, responses came flooding back from survivor enclaves across the continent. A fortified shopping complex in Chicago led by a former firefighter named Gregory Santos, a university campus in Austin where Professor Elizabeth Morgan had organized 300 students and faculty, a repurposed prison in Nevada run by Warden Michael Chin, and dozens of smaller groups who'd been fighting isolated battles suddenly realizing they were part of a larger war. Patricia coordinated a massive conference call using Dylan's jury-rigged communication system, and Marcus listened as leaders from across the shattered nation pledged to work together, to share intelligence, to launch coordinated strikes against the alien installations that Dylan had mapped using hacked satellite feeds. The plan was audacious and desperate in equal measure. Simultaneous attacks on alien ground facilities in 6 major cities, timed to overwhelm their ability to respond, designed to prove that humanity could still bite back even while facing extinction. Fort Carson would lead the assault on the Denver facility, a massive processing center where aliens were conducting their experiments on both living humans and the infected. Marcus volunteered to lead the strike team, taking Robert, Jessica Parks, and 20 of Patricia's best soldiers, while Dylan stayed behind to coordinate communications and provide real-time intelligence. But not everyone at Fort Carson agreed with Patricia's aggressive strategy. Major Vincent Cole called for a meeting 2 days before the planned assault, and Marcus arrived to find him surrounded by nearly 50 survivors who wore expressions of fear and desperate hope. Vincent was a good soldier, but he'd always valued caution over courage, and now he argued passionately that attacking the aliens was suicide, that humanity should try to communicate, to negotiate, to prove their worth through cooperation rather than violence. "They're testing us," Vincent said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "So let's pass the test. Let's show them we're intelligent enough to seek peace, advanced enough to put aside our violent instincts. Maybe if we help them with their research, if we volunteer information about human biology and culture, they'll spare us." Marcus felt disgust rising in his throat, but it was Patricia who responded with cold fury. "They've already killed millions, Major. They unleashed a plague that turned our loved ones into monsters, and now they're deciding whether to exterminate the rest of us like we're nothing more than lab rats that didn't perform tricks well enough. There's no negotiating with something that sees you as fundamentally disposable." The argument fractured the fort's fragile unity, with some survivors siding with Vincent's desperate hope for mercy while others rallied behind Patricia's call for defiance. The debate raged through the night until Emma Rodriguez, the 9-year-old girl Marcus had rescued, walked into the center of the argument and spoke with a clarity that silenced everyone. "My mom and dad didn't get a chance to negotiate," she said, her small voice somehow filling the entire space. "The zombies ate them while I hid in a closet and listened to them scream. And you know what was outside our window? One of those ships, just watching, just recording like it was some nature documentary. They knew what was happening and they didn't stop it because they didn't care. So I don't care what they want from us now." The truth spoken by a child who'd lost everything cut through the politics and fear, and Marcus saw the moment when Vincent's support crumbled, when even those desperate for peace realized that mercy from the aliens was a fantasy. But Vincent himself remained unconvinced, and that night he took 12 followers and slipped out of the fort, taking weapons and supplies, leaving a note that said he was going to make contact with the aliens and broker a truce whether Patricia approved or not. Marcus wanted to go after them, but Patricia stopped him with a hand on his shoulder and words that tasted like ashes. "Let them go. We can't save people from their own delusions, and we can't afford the distraction when the real fight is coming." She was right, and Marcus hated her for it. 2 days later, as they prepared to launch the assault on Denver, Dylan picked up a transmission from Vincent's group. Screaming, pleading, the sounds of alien weapons firing and something worse underneath, the moaning of fresh infected. The aliens had turned Vincent and his followers, adding them to the horde, a clear message about what they thought of human attempts at negotiation. The attack was set for dawn, and as Marcus checked his weapons and said goodbye to Emma, he knew that tomorrow would determine whether humanity still had the strength to fight for its survival, or whether the aliens had already broken their spirit beyond repair. The assault on the Denver processing facility began at dawn with coordinated strikes from 4 directions, explosives planted by advanced teams detonating simultaneously and tearing holes in the alien installation's outer walls while infected hordes caught in containment pens shrieked and clawed at their restraints. Marcus led his team through the eastern breach, firing controlled bursts at the floating drone sentries that descended like mechanical wasps, their energy weapons scorching the concrete where his people had stood seconds before. Jessica Parks took down 3 drones with her modified rifle before a blast caught her shoulder, sending her spinning to the ground where Robert grabbed her and dragged her to cover while Marcus and his soldiers pushed deeper into the facility's twisting corridors. What they found inside turned his stomach: laboratory chambers filled with humans in various stages of infection, aliens in environmental suits making clinical observations as people transformed into monsters, their screams recorded and analyzed like data points in some cosmic research paper. Marcus wanted to free them all, but Patricia's voice crackled through his radio with cold necessity, reminding him that their mission was intelligence gathering and sabotage, not rescue, because saving a dozen people meant nothing if humanity lost the war. Dylan guided them through the facility using blueprints he'd pulled from hacked alien databases, leading them toward the central control nexus where the processing center connected to something much larger. A data stream flowing directly to the massive mothership that hung in the sky above Denver like a dark moon. Marcus made a decision that he knew Patricia would hate but couldn't avoid. They needed to get onto that mothership, needed to find out what the aliens were really planning and whether there was any weakness they could exploit. Jessica, even wounded, volunteered to stay behind with half the team to hold the facility and maintain their exit route, while Marcus took Robert and 4 soldiers into the gravity lift that pulsed with sickly blue light at the Nexus Chamber's center. The sensation of being pulled upward defied every law of physics Marcus understood, his stomach lurching as they rose through a beam of pure energy that deposited them inside the mothership's cavernous interior, a space so vast that clouds formed against its ceiling and the far walls disappeared into mist. The architecture was impossible and beautiful and terrifying, all flowing organic curves mixed with crystalline technology that pulsed with bioluminescent light, and through translucent walls Marcus could see other chambers filled with creatures that definitely weren't human and definitely weren't zombies. Specimens from other worlds, other species that had apparently failed the aliens' tests before Earth's turn came. Robert found a console that Dylan was able to access remotely through Marcus's helmet camera, the teenager's fingers flying across his keyboard back at Fort Carson while he translated alien databases that contained information spanning thousands of years. What they learned made Marcus's blood run cold. Earth was the 47th world these aliens had evaluated, and the previous 46 had all been found wanting, their populations eliminated and their planets seeded with new species deemed more evolutionarily promising. The aliens called themselves the Architects, and they saw themselves as cosmic gardeners, weeding out civilizations that didn't meet their standards for survival, cooperation, and adaptive intelligence. But there was something else in the database, buried in scientific logs that Dylan barely understood, schematics for a device that generated the frequencies controlling the zombie virus, and more importantly, specifications for its countermeasure, a signal that could theoretically neutralize the pathogen and halt the infection process. Marcus was transmitting the data back to Dylan when one of his soldiers, a young corporal named Brandon Wright, suddenly turned his weapon on the group with trembling hands and eyes that held desperate madness. "I'm sorry," Brandon said, his voice breaking. "They contacted me before the mission, showed me my sister. She's alive, they have her in one of their holding facilities. They promised to release her if I stopped you from stealing their research." Marcus tried to talk him down, to explain that the aliens would never keep that promise, but Brandon was beyond reason, consumed by the impossible hope of saving family, and he fired a burst that killed 2 soldiers before Robert's shotgun blast ended his betrayal and his anguish in one terrible moment. Alarms screamed through the mothership as alien security forces converged on their position, and Marcus grabbed the portable drive containing the countermeasure data while screaming for everyone to get back to the gravity lift. They ran through corridors that shifted and changed like a living maze, the ship itself trying to trap them, and Marcus had to leave Robert behind when his old friend took a defensive position to buy them escape time, his last words a defiant curse at the aliens and a reminder to Marcus to make it count. Marcus and the 2 remaining soldiers tumbled out of the gravity lift back into the Denver facility where Jessica and her team laid down covering fire, and they fought their way back through the breach and into the trucks while the entire installation began to collapse from the explosives Patricia's engineers had placed throughout its foundation. As they drove away from the burning ruins with alien ships swarming the sky behind them, Dylan's voice came through the radio with electric excitement, telling them he'd cracked the countermeasure data, that it was real, that they finally had a weapon that might turn the tide. But Marcus could barely hear him over the memory of Robert's sacrifice and Brandon's betrayal and the weight of knowing that 46 other worlds had fought this same fight and lost. Dylan worked for 72 hours straight on the alien countermeasure data, his eyes bloodshot and hands shaking from exhaustion and stimulants, until Amanda finally forced him to sleep while she and 3 other scientists Patricia had gathered continued the work. What they discovered was both miraculous and horrifying. The alien frequency device could indeed neutralize the zombie virus, but it required massive power sources and broadcast towers that humanity no longer had access to after months of infrastructure collapse. But Dylan, brilliant even in exhaustion, proposed an alternative that made everyone in the room fall silent with the audacity of it. If they couldn't neutralize the virus, they could modify the alien control frequencies they'd observed, essentially hacking the same technology the Architects used to herd the infected and turning it against them. They could transform the zombie hordes from an alien weapon into humanity's unwitting army, directing the infected to attack the very installations and ships that had created them. Patricia approved the plan immediately and reached out to the other survivor enclaves, coordinating what would be the largest human military operation since the outbreak began. The target was New York City, where the architects had established their primary North American command center in what remained of Manhattan, a massive structure of alien architecture that had grown like a metallic cancer from the ruins of downtown. Intelligence from Gregory Santos's Chicago group indicated the architects were preparing for the final phase of their evaluation, which everyone understood meant total extermination of remaining human resistance. The attack needed to happen now before humanity lost its last chance to fight back. Marcus found himself on a transport convoy heading east with 200 soldiers and civilians from Fort Carson, including Katie Sullivan, who'd trained as a combat medic, and young Emma Rodriguez, who'd learned to shoot with unsettling accuracy despite Patricia's attempts to keep children away from the fighting. Amanda came too, insisting that her medical expertise might be crucial, and Marcus couldn't deny that her steady presence had become something he relied on during the darkest moments. The journey to New York took 5 days through territories where infected wandered in massive packs and alien patrols swept the highways with sensor beams, but Dylan had designed signal jammers that kept them hidden from architect detection. They rendezvoused with forces from 7 other enclaves in the ruins of Philadelphia, and Marcus met legendary survivors he'd only heard about on radio transmissions, Gregory Santos, whose scarred face and quiet intensity commanded instant respect, Professor Elizabeth Morgan, who'd written tactical analysis that had saved hundreds of lives, and Lieutenant Commander David Richardson, a Navy officer who'd brought 60 sailors from a submarine that had surfaced to find the world ended. Together they commanded nearly 800 fighters, the largest human force assembled since civilization collapsed, and possibly the last army humanity would ever field. They reached the outskirts of Manhattan at dusk and positioned Dylan's modified frequency broadcasters in a perimeter around the Architect Command Center, devices cobbled together from alien technology and human desperation that hummed with barely contained energy. When Marcus gave the signal, the broadcasters activated simultaneously, sending out pulses that rippled through the infected hordes scattered across the city like invisible shockwaves. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Thousands of zombies stopped their aimless wandering and turned as one toward the architect's structure, their moans rising into a collective shriek of hunger and rage that echoed off ruined skyscrapers. The architects responded by launching their ships and ground forces to intercept, and suddenly the streets of New York became a three-way battlefield unlike anything in human history. Infected crashed against alien defensive positions in waves of rotting flesh and snapping teeth while human strike teams moved through the chaos, targeting architect installations with explosives and salvaged energy weapons. Marcus led his squad through subway tunnels that brought them up inside the architect perimeter, fighting both infected that had breached the alien lines and the floating mechanical sentries that filled the air like deadly fireflies. It was during a brief moment of cover behind an overturned vehicle that Amanda made her discovery, grabbing Marcus's arm and pointing to an infected woman who stood motionless while others charged past her. The woman was crying, actual tears streaming down her deteriorated face, and her mouth was forming words through the typical zombie moans. "Help me please, still in here." Amanda approached despite Marcus's protests and looked into the infected woman's eyes, seeing recognition and terror and consciousness trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed its owner's will. "They're still aware," Amanda said, her voice breaking with the horror of it. "Some of them, the ones infected more recently, they're still conscious inside, watching themselves attack people, unable to stop it. This isn't just death, it's a prison." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow because it meant every infected person they'd killed might have still had their mind intact, screaming silently while their bodies committed atrocities. The tactical implications were staggering, but there was no time to process them because the Architect Command Center's weapons came online, massive energy cannons that swept across the battlefield and vaporized everything they touched, human and infected alike. And Marcus realized the aliens had decided that if they couldn't control the situation, they would simply destroy it all and start over with whatever species they deemed worthy next. The Architect energy cannons carved destruction through Manhattan's ruins with mechanical precision, but their very activation created the opportunity Marcus had been waiting for. The massive power draw made the command center's shields flicker and fail in rotating sections, creating brief windows of vulnerability that Dylan identified and transmitted to all strike teams. Marcus rallied his squad and pushed forward through the maelstrom of infected bodies and alien weapons fire, watching Gregory Santos's team breach the western wall while Elizabeth Morgan's people set charges on the northern support columns. The architects had made a fatal miscalculation in their arrogance. They'd assumed humans would never coordinate effectively under pressure, never sacrifice themselves for abstract concepts like species survival, and that assumption was killing them as 800 fighters proved that humanity's greatest strength had always been our stubborn refusal to accept extinction quietly. Marcus reached the command center's main entrance where alien soldiers in biomechanical armor held a defensive position, but a wave of infected crashed into them from the side, drawn by Dylan's frequency signals, and the aliens discovered that their energy weapons were brutally effective but not unlimited as power cells depleted under the endless assault. Inside the structure's vast central chamber, Marcus found himself standing before the architect leadership. 3 beings that resembled elongated humans filtered through a nightmare, their pale skin translucent enough to show the bioluminescent organs pulsing beneath, their enormous black eyes regarding him with what might have been curiosity or contempt. One of them spoke through a translation device in a voice like wine through broken glass, asking why humanity continued fighting when their evaluation scores made extinction inevitable, when 46 previous species had accepted their judgment with greater dignity. Marcus thought of Robert bleeding out on the mothership, of Brandon's desperate betrayal, of the conscious infected woman trapped inside her own deteriorating body, of Emma's parents and the millions of others who'd never gotten a chance to prove anything except that they could die screaming. He raised his rifle and answered with bullets instead of words, shattering the translator and the smug certainty in those alien eyes. The other strike teams converged on the chamber as Patricia's voice crackled through the radio, reporting that satellite feeds showed architect ships beginning to retreat from Earth's atmosphere, falling back to their motherships, and Marcus understood that the aliens had finally recognized that humans might actually win this battle and couldn't accept the humiliation of losing to a species they deemed inferior. Dylan's voice interrupted with frantic urgency, explaining that the command center's reactor was being deliberately overloaded, set to detonate with enough force to vaporize everything within 20 miles, a final vindictive act to eliminate the human resistance even in defeat. The evacuation order went out immediately, soldiers and civilians running for extraction points while the building shook with increasing violence, but Marcus saw on his tactical display that the reactor controls were locked behind security that would take Dylan hours to crack remotely, hours they didn't have. Amanda saw the same information and met his eyes with understanding and sorrow, but it was Emma who grabbed his hand and told him quietly that he'd promised to teach her fishing when this was over, made him promise again before she let Katie pull her toward the exits. Marcus sent his squad away and stayed behind with Dylan talking in his ear, the teenager's voice breaking as he guided Marcus through the alien interface, his untrained fingers manipulating controls designed for beings with different neural architecture, knowing that each second he delayed was a second his people used to escape. The reactor achieved critical mass as Marcus finally accessed the override system, and he had perhaps 3 seconds to make a choice. He could try to shut it down and probably fail, or he could accelerate the detonation and direct the explosion upward, channeling it through the building's energy weapons array into the mothership that hung in the sky like a target he'd been waiting months to hit. He chose fire and vengeance, slamming his fist down on controls he barely understood, and felt rather than heard the explosion that consumed him and the entire architect command structure and reached up with furious human spite to tear the mothership in half. The shockwave knocked fleeing survivors off their feet 2 miles away, and they turned to see the fireball rising into the morning sky, see the burning wreckage of the alien vessel falling in pieces into the Hudson River, see the other motherships accelerating toward deep space in what could only be called retreat. In the aftermath, Amanda's research using captured architect technology led to a modified frequency that gradually restored consciousness to infected individuals, allowing them to die peacefully or, in rare cases where the infection was recent, recover partially with extensive treatment. The virus itself weakened without alien intervention, becoming less transmissible, less virulent, giving humanity time to develop treatments and protocols. Patricia Monroe became the de facto leader of the Eastern Survivor Coalition, working with Gregory Santos and others to rebuild some semblance of civilization from the ashes. Dylan received Marcus's final radio transmission in a recording that made him weep, the older man's voice telling him he'd done good work, that humanity survived because of his brilliant mind, that he should use it to build something better than what came before. Emma Rodriguez grew up in the settlement Fort Carson became, learning to fish from a photograph of Marcus Rivera that she kept on her wall alongside her parents, and when she was old enough she joined the Planetary Defense Force that monitored the skies for any sign of the architect's return. Because while humanity had won this battle, while they'd proven themselves worthy of survival through blood and sacrifice and impossible courage, they all knew the truth that kept them vigilant through the long work of rebuilding. Somewhere in the dark between stars the architects were still watching, still evaluating, and possibly still gardening their cosmic experiment. But Earth's garden had grown thorns, and humanity would be ready if they ever came back to prune.